Recently, we asked some people about sharing their New York Times accounts.
My name is Dana. I am a subscriber to the New York Times, but my husband isn't. And it would be really nice to be able to share a recipe or an article or compete with him in Wordle or Connections. Thank you.
Dana, we heard you. Introducing the New York Times Family Subscription. One subscription, up to 4 separate logins for anyone in your life. Find out more at nytimes.com/family.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
Here's the first thing you need to know about Michael Feinberg. He does not like the director of the FBI, Kash Patel.
He's a clown. This is somebody who is only willing to engage with intellectual arguments in as much as they will help him force his political vision on others.
Michael spent 16 years at the FBI himself, and he has done the research when it comes to Kash Patel.
I read his books. It was clear his name was always in the mix for becoming the director if Trump won the 2024 election. So I read Government Gangsters, I read his 3 children's books, and it became very apparent that this is not a serious thinker.
You might not be surprised to learn that Michael left government service a few months back, but with Kash Patel testifying in front of Congress this week, I thought he could offer useful insight into what's been going on at the Bureau. Long story short, he knows a whole lot of people who, like him, have left.
Almost everybody I knew wanted to stay in and hold the line as best we could. But the loss of state capacity in terms of our ability to protect people from both crime and national security threats is vanishing at an alarming rate if it's not already gone.
Michael describes a bureau whose mission has been warped from the top down. Many agents have been reassigned to work on immigration issues, for instance, which is fine, in theory, except that means there are other investigations that have been abandoned. Michael even discovered that some agents who were riding along with Homeland Security were asking the FBI to pay for their face coverings. That really bothered him.
Their concern was if they are the only ones who are not masked, if the only ones not hiding who they are FBI agents, they're going to get blamed for the operations while the people actually pushing this forward are going to go unscathed. And I'm sympathetic to that. I'm very sympathetic to the FBI agents who don't feel this is what we should be doing and don't want to be associated with it. But I think democratic norms and government transparency, it needs to be given a higher priority than that.
Back in May, Michael got a call telling him the FBI's top brass was displeased with him because he'd maintained a friendship with an old colleague who had wound up on Kash Patel's enemies list. This meant a promotion Michael was up for was out. He was told to expect a lie detector test in his future.
In my situation, it got to the point where they made very clear I was not going to be in a position where I was able to exercise any authority over the office. I was probably not going to be doing any investigative work. I was going to be shuffled off to a room somewhere to just stare at 4 walls for 8 hours a day. And that's when I decided it was time to leave. And look, I walked away from my pension. I walked away from my health benefits. I walked away from my income. I don't want you to think this was an easy decision.
Yeah, you've said that there are people inside who basically asked you to continue speaking out.
Explicitly, yes. And I'm talking to everybody from line agents to very senior executives, from people with whom I've been friends for decades, to individuals I've never met who somehow got my signal contact and reached out to me to say they're glad I'm talking about what's going on.
You feel like anyone's listening?
I don't know. But what I always say, and what it is incredibly important people realize, is despite all the reporting, despite all the rumors, despite all the accounts that trickle out, the American people really have no idea just how bad it actually is.
Today on the show, it seems like Kash Patel's FBI is in trouble. Is the agency fixable? I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news in Washington right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation concerns, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen. This episode is brought to you by Saks Fifth Avenue. With the weather getting cooler, if you're like me, you're looking around for a couple of new items for your wardrobe, like a new sweater, some cute new kicks. And Saks Fifth Avenue makes it easy to get creative with your personal style and find the best arrivals for fall. I went over to Saks.com to check out what they've got on tap, and I gotta say, what I love about clicking around their website is that every piece looks special, one of a kind, as if you'd walk into the office or a party and instantly grab everyone's attention. All the big brands are there, stuff like Alice and Olivia, you know, the young and trendy stuff. I love that I can see the care in every piece Saks has chosen for their fall collections. Each dress or pant or shoe feels a little bit elevated. So if you want shopping to be fun and easy, head over to Saks Fifth Avenue for inspiring ways to elevate your personal style every day. I wanted to understand just how much the FBI has changed since the president retook office and put Kash Patel in charge. So I called up Quinta Jurecic. She reports on the Bureau over at The Atlantic. The first thing I asked Quinta to do was establish a baseline for me. Tell me how the FBI was working, say, a year ago.
You know, it was more or less working as you would want it to work. Agents were doing their jobs. It was meant to be an apolitical organization. It had been involved in all kinds of politically sensitive investigations, but was basically itself doing its best to stay out of the spotlight. That said, this was an agency, even at this point last year, that had gone through some tough times. Obviously, it was sort of thrust into the spotlight with the comments by FBI Director James Comey in 2016 about the Hillary Clinton email investigation. It stayed in the spotlight thanks to the various investigations into Trump, both in the first Trump term and then in the Biden administration, the investigations into the January 6th, into the Trump documents case in Mar-a-Lago. And I think that it was really in a tough spot.
All of this weighed on some individual agents who were being led at the time by Christopher Wray. Wray had been appointed by Donald Trump during his first administration, but he remained in place during Joe Biden's time in office.
My sense is that there was a lot of frustration among the rank and file that Wray was not sticking up when the Bureau received political attacks. And so in one sense, it was functioning, normally. In another sense, it was already a institution that I think was starting to crack at the edges under the strain of sort of being in the political spotlight and not having a leadership that was particularly willing or able to defend its integrity.
So Kash Patel comes in. He's also a critic of the agency. He had been quite outspoken about the FBI and like the fact that he wanted to close down the Washington office, for instance. So how was he greeted when he moved into his role?
I think there was a lot of uncertainty. He had, as you said, positioned himself as a pretty fierce critic of the Bureau, described it as a, agency of the deep state, as, something that the leadership needed to be fired for their, involvement in investigating Trump and investigating January 6th. But on the other hand, he had said during his confirmation hearing, I will not, I don't remember the specific wording, but it was something along the lines of that, saying that he wouldn't be involved in politicized firings.
How did that work out?
Well, it seems like not that well, because actually last week there was a lawsuit filed from a number of agents who were fired by Patel for political reasons because they had somehow caught the ire of the White House, who filed a lawsuit essentially saying, look, Patel pushed us out allegedly because we were somehow, displeasing to the president and to the president's allies. And they illegally fired us. And there are lots of quotes in there from Patel saying essentially, look, I have to do this because the president and his allies want it. So it seems like though he made that promise in front of the Senate, it may not have lasted very long.
Yeah, the lawsuit really paints Kash Patel as cartoonish, like really into giving out these challenge coins that are like little, I guess, rewards for FBI agents. It seemed crazy, the details in here.
It is bizarre. So I will say, in his limited defense, challenge coins are pretty common in the national security bureaucracy. I have some challenge coins that people have given me. You get them, when you achieve something, right? Or, you make a new friend, right? But Patel's is described as somewhat absurd. It's oversized. They're usually about the size of maybe a dollar coin. And then on it, it says Director Kash Patel with the S as a $.
No.
So I have never seen a challenge coin that looked like that, I will say.
That's crazy. That's like something you get at Chuck E. Cheese.
Yeah, it comes off as, it's literally larger than life, right? It's a challenge coin, but it's a big challenge coin where his name is spelled in a cool way. So there is this really cartoonish element where he seems to be this figure. He comes off as this figure who is really out of his depth, who is better at performing himself than he is at actually doing what is a very serious job.
Yeah. One of the plaintiffs here basically alleges that Dan Bongino, who's the deputy to Kash Patel, was spending more time online, like on Twitter, trying to rile up his fans than he was actually leading the FBI, which is kind of not surprising, but kind of alarming too.
It's disturbing. This is a big organization. It is a complicated organization. It's an organization that does a lot of important work. They're doing counterintelligence work. They're doing counterterrorism work. They're conducting, when I say the FBI does criminal investigations, I don't mean, they're slapping cuffs on someone who, stuck up a bank. I mean, they're doing complex, sometimes multi-year criminal investigations into all kinds of things, right? Drug trafficking, child abuse, white-collar crime. And so the idea that the leadership of the organization is posting all day and terrified of what the president is saying about them, it's not just that they're distracted, it's that what they're distracted from is actually really important work that goes directly to the public safety of the country, which is exactly what Trump and his allies say that they are so concerned about.
How has the FBI seemed to shift focus in terms of what it investigates under Kash Patel?
It seems like the Bureau has really shifted its resources toward immigration enforcement. I had heard this anecdotally. There are some numbers from the Cato Institute that just came out the other day that produced an estimate that about 1/5 of agents at the Bureau have been shifted onto immigration enforcement.
Is that a lot?
Yes, that is a significant number of agents. It's thousands. And those are all people who have other jobs. These are not people who are sitting at their desks twiddling their thumbs who are now being moved on to assisting with immigration raids. These are people who were working cases. And there was actually a story on MSNBC this very morning that agents who were involved in domestic terrorism investigations, including domestic terrorism investigations that were linked to serious acts of child abuse, that some of those agents have been moved on to assisting with immigration enforcement. And so I think we see that shift in action. It is hard to see from the outside because, these are people who are working on very sensitive matters that aren't usually discussed publicly. But I do think that shift is real, and we are going to start seeing the effects, if not in, things that happen that should have been prevented, hopefully not, in the very least at, things that aren't being prosecuted, right? It's going to be the child abuse network that isn't shut down, that kind of thing. And so in that sense, I think the effects are very serious, but they may be, unfortunately, hard for the public to sort of see and understand, precisely because it's going to be dogs that don't bark.
So you've laid out a whole bunch of ways that the FBI seems incredibly messy in this moment. A bunch of agents have been fired. Of course, like all places, people, I imagine, can take buyouts if they wanted to. Do we know how many people have left in one way or another over the last 9 months?
I have not seen numbers. Anecdotally, it is high enough that at least one person who I spoke to said that he was concerned about the ability of the Bureau to continue its work. Not just because of the volume of people who are leaving, but because the people who are leaving are the experts, the old hands, right? People who are eligible for retirement are retiring. And that means that you have people who have a lot of that institutional knowledge and just, know how to investigate a case who are leaving. There's also the question of the quality of the people who the Bureau is bringing in.
Yeah, there was just reporting that the FBI is planning to lower its requirements for agents. Like, they don't have to go to college. They only spend 8 weeks at Quantico training versus 18. It seems like actually pretty significant changes.
Exactly. And so I think that there is real concern within the Bureau that, they're losing the old hands. They're gaining people who are not being trained in the same way and who are also, signing on to a Bureau that is the Bureau as run by Kash Patel. The Bureau has tried really hard, really in the years since J. Edgar Hoover, to put itself forward as an organization that is kind of technocratic, apolitical, expert. And Patel, in many ways, is undermining those foundations. And so there's this additional question of what happens when not only you have the old guard leaving, but when the new people who come in are coming into a Bureau that is operating according to a different system of values than it maintained even a year ago.
We'll be back after a quick break. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news in Washington right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation concerns, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen.
Comcast is committed to bringing access to the internet to all Americans, including rural communities across the country, like Sussex County, Delaware.
We were being left behind. Everybody around us seemed to have internet, but we did not. High-speed internet is one of those good things that we needed to help us move our farming, our small businesses, our recreation forward.
Learn more about how we're bringing our next-generation network to more people across the country at ComcastCorporation.com/investment in America.
This is a real good story about Bronx and his dad, Ryan, real United Airlines customers.
We were returning home, and one of the flight attendants asked Bronx if he wanted to see the flight deck and meet Captain Andrew.
I got to sit in the driver's seat.
I grew up in an aviation family, and seeing Bronx kind of reminded me of myself when I was that age.
That's Andrew, a real United pilot.
These small interactions can shape a kid's future.
It felt like I was the captain.
Allowing my son to see the flight deck will stick with us forever.
That's how good leads the way.
So all this stuff is happening at the FBI already. And then last week, Charlie Kirk is murdered. How did that really shake things up for Kash Patel in particular, but also at the FBI generally?
Again, it put Patel in the spotlight. And the way he responded seemed to be by trying to feed as much information as possible to his followers as the investigation was going on. There was a string of sort of very odd posts where he made one post saying, you know, we have someone in custody. We have the suspect in custody. I think his exact words were, "We got him." And then a couple hours later, he posted another tweet saying, essentially, actually, we don't have him. You know, we've let the suspect go. The investigation continues.
Could you imagine any other FBI director doing any of these tweets?
I cannot. I mean, it is not typical for any number of reasons. It might cause FBI agents who saw the tweet, who were on the trail, to sort of hesitate for a moment, which in a really high stakes investigation could be dangerous. Something could slip through their fingers. It could cause confusion among the public and mean that there's doubts that surface the next time the Bureau says that they actually got someone, And then there's a danger, that it puts someone in danger who was innocent if people, start doing some sleuthing and decide that the person who, are able to identify the person who was picked up for questioning and then released, that person could be in danger. And after Patel posted that kind of walk back, I got a text from a former FBI agent that was just a photo of Richard Jewell, the security guard who identified pipe bombs that were planted at the 1996 Atlanta Olympics, and who it was leaked that the FBI suspected him of planting the bombs. And he was really put through the ringer by the press.
His life was ruined.
Exactly. And so, in this instance, obviously, so the Jewell case, that was the press that leaked it. In this case, it was Patel. He didn't list a name, but there are real reasons why you don't sort of live post an investigation. And it really seemed like Patel did not understand that.
Yeah. Patel's been out in the media defending himself, saying he wants to be transparent with information, things like that. But does it feel like he is... Does it feel like he's doing a good job of defending himself, I guess?
What I would say is that there is a difference between being transparent and responsibly running a law enforcement investigation. There are good reasons why investigators don't provide regular updates, because they look at a lot of leads that don't pan out. And I think you have seen this in a number of stories that have appeared in the right-wing press, at least one of which on Fox News. I think Patel himself actually reposted on Twitter, on X, saying, the FBI is questioning the roommate of the shooter, speculating about the roommate's gender identity and whether the roommate might have been in a romantic relationship with the shooter. And Patel posted that on Twitter. Again, it's really difficult for me to see why you would want to publicize that information, because it potentially could really create problems in your investigation if, now people who know the roommate know that you're talking to the roommate. Maybe they're going to delete their stuff on social media and you'll lose some leads. The fact that you are essentially acknowledging leaked details about an investigation, I would worry, certainly, and some folks who I spoke to suggested that this worry was justified, who are formerly law enforcement themselves, that is going to incentivize people to not cooperate with the FBI in the future, because essentially what it's saying is, if you come and help us with an investigation, you're at serious risk of details about yourself being broadcast to the entire world. I mean, why would you cooperate with the FBI after that?
This week, Kash Patel is appearing in front of Congress. He's answering questions about all sorts of things, from the Epstein files to the Charlie Kirk assassination investigation. So far, the hearings have mostly gone the way you'd expect. Democrats are bearing down on Patel. Republicans are lobbing him softballs. And Patel himself is defending his leadership. Quinta says the best indication that Kash Patel might actually be in trouble isn't coming from Capitol Hill. It's coming from X, where some right-wing voices like Christopher Rufo have started criticizing the FBI director. On Friday, Rufo posted, "It is time for Republicans to assess whether Kash Patel is the right man to run the FBI."
What I found so interesting about Rufo's post is that he really seemed to be saying, I'm questioning whether Kash Patel is the right man to run the FBI. That's a quote. But the reason that he's saying that is he's worried that Kash Patel's FBI would be ineffective. What Rufo says that he wants as a path forward is, and I quote, "Federal law enforcement makes a credible plan to restore the civil order, initiates a campaign to disrupt domestic terror networks in all 50 states, and sets them in motion with the goal of preventing further bloodshed." This is, of course, referring to the aftermath of Kirk's murder. And in the days after Rufo's post, we've also seen some rhetoric from a number of figures, including the vice president, suggesting that the goal here is really to sort of crack down on the political opposition, on left-wing groups. Now, just taking Rufo's post at its face value, I do think what he's kind of saying is, we need an FBI that has state capacity. We need an FBI that can investigate. We need an FBI that can do things. To extend it to what Vance says, we need an FBI that can crack down on the opposition. And in order to have that, whether, for good or for ill, you need an FBI that is effective and can carry out its job in a way that is not slapdash and disordered. And I think the concern is that Patel, as this kind of influencer director, is just not a person who is in a position to do that.
So you're saying Rufo wants to make the FBI more effective at doing things you really disagree with?
I think the suggestion that the FBI should be used to crack down on political opposition, as the White House has suggested and as Rufo hinted in that post, is deeply disturbing and recalls the worst moments of the Bureau. Under J. Edgar Hoover during the COINTELPRO program, for example, where the Bureau was regularly carrying out illegal searches, conducting illegal surveillance on civil rights groups, on Martin Luther King Jr. Now, the Bureau had built in a lot of protections against those kinds of abuses in the decades since, in large part after public outcry. And so I think that, there is a danger that we go back into that place, in part because we now appear to have leadership at the Bureau that is not as attentive to the importance of, really learning and holding on to those lessons. I think the difference here is the nature of Trump's leadership. This is, political scientists would call it a very personalist style of governance. It's built around the particular whims and moods of the guy at the top, Donald Trump, where, somebody tweets something, it gets on Fox, Trump sees it, he says something, a policy is built around it. So there's an inherent kind of messiness to that process that is just at odds with the idea of building a sort of ruthlessly functioning organization. There's a kind of sloppiness, if that makes sense. And I have certainly wondered whether that sloppiness is just inherently at odds with building this kind of repressive apparatus. Now, I want to emphasize that doesn't mean that the administration won't try. And that doesn't mean that its attempts won't be extremely damaging. But I do think it means that there's an inherent level of sloppiness that they may not be able to completely tamp out just because of how they're going about the project to begin with.
Quinta, I'm so grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Quinta Jurecic is a staff writer at The Atlantic. She reports on the rule of law, legal challenges to the Trump administration, and the state of the FBI. Earlier, I spoke to Michael Feinberg. Mike was the assistant special agent in charge of the FBI's field office in Norfolk, Virginia. He resigned back in June, and now he's a fellow at Lawfare. All right, that's our show. What Next is produced by Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, and Madeline Ducharme. Paige Osburn is the senior supervising producer for What Next and What Next TBD. Mia Lobel is the head of audio at Slate. Ben Richmond is the senior director of podcast operations. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky. Say, hey, I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. Catch you back here next time. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise.
What are you hoping to see by 2050?
And this is quite a statement. I think we will certainly have demonstrated that space-based solar power can be done and that you can have not just detectable power, but useful power transmitted from space to Earth.
Today, I'm joined by Lauren Lyons. She's an incredibly accomplished aerospace consultant, engineer, former SpaceX and Blue Origin mission lead. Join me, Chris Hadfield, on the On Energy podcast.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts.